I was intimidated by stranded color work. It was not any of the annoying things that I thought it might be, and it was so much fun. Hi, hello, my name is Allie. I'm an independent graphic designer coming to you from just outside Toronto, and this is my channel where I talk about what I'm knitting, how it's going, and what it's costing me. But today I'm so excited because today we're talking about my first stranded colorwork project and my whole experience knitting it start to finish, because I've never done colorwork before. I really didn't know what to expect going into it. I've always just sort of been one to dive headfirst into new types of knitting just based off of what do I want to knit, what's the end result I want, and then I kind of figure out what I need to learn to do that. But for some reason, stranded colorwork is kind of the one major thing I hadn't ventured into yet, something that was giving me a little bit of pause for reasons I can't even quite put my finger on, but I thought it might be useful to do a whole video all about that process, kind of start to finish, especially if you are kind of in a similar boat where you're like, I like the idea, but for some reason, I'm just hesitating. I think that it can help to just have a little bit more insight into the process, and especially what it was like to experience for someone experiencing it for the first time. Before we get into all that though, as for my tea of the day, I'm drinking the Autumn Bold from Keats & Co, which if perhaps Autumn Bold isn't very seasonally appropriate, it does feel appropriate to what I'm wearing, which is also not seasonally appropriate. I am already sweating, so wish me luck. But this is a tea from Keats & Co that's a really nice like apple crisp kind of flavor. Don't think they have it around this time of year, but all of their teas are so good, and also all of their profits go toward the treatment of tuberculosis. So like, what's not to like? I do have a discount for them that's always in my description box below if you didn't know, and if you want to give them a shot. But yeah, it's really helping put me in the right mood to sit here in a giant wool sweater and talk to you about it for the next couple of hours, probably on the recording end, despite the fact that it is about 27 degrees Celsius here today. Okay, so to lay some groundwork a little bit so that you know kind of where I was at going into this project, I started knitting in February of 2022. So it's actually been just over 3 years now. And in that time, I have done a lot of different kinds of knitting, different stitch patterns. I learned cabling extremely early on. Bubble stitch. I've done lots of things that are all over rib. I've done some half fisherman's rib. I have done stripes, so kind of teetering into the area of colorwork, and I've also done intarsia, which is one of the other major forms of colorwork knitting. So in the span of my sort of knitting oeuvre, if you will, I feel like I've covered a lot of bases, and this kind of seemed like a glaring omission, and it started to sort of become clear to me that I was a little bit avoiding it. And I think there are a couple sort of partial reasons for it, but I still don't think this entirely accounts for it. I think there was just something that was a bit of an enigma to me about the whole thing, but partly I was concerned about my tension because I'm already a very tight knitter by default, and I worried that that would cause problems, especially puckering in my finished object, and then I might have a really hard time avoiding that. And then I think the second issue was sort of a perfectionistic one, where I have kind of heard of different methods of knitting stranded colorwork that make it more efficient. And I think the one that was sort of foremost in my brain was the idea of knitting one color English style, which is how I knit, and the other color continental, or variations on this idea of holding both strands at the same time, where you're holding both of them in whichever hand you usually knit with. So I think I kind of had it in my head that if I was gonna do stranded colorwork, I would need to learn to knit continental. And I mean, that's just an enormous obstacle. So I think that was kind of part of it, but I think I also knew that wasn't necessary. So this doesn't entirely account for the delay, but I think that those couple of things paired with just not yet having found kind of the absolute perfect project, like most of the other things that I knit that were kind of ambitious for my level of knitting at the time, were just things where I was like, ooh, I really want to make that. And so then I would just kind of figure out how to make it work. And I just hadn't yet encountered a stranded colorwork design that rose to a high enough level of, oh my god, I want to make that it superseded all of these other things that I also wanted to make, which felt a little bit more approachable. So the idea of stranded colorwork just kind of always got knocked further down the list, and it didn't rise to the top of it until I kind of cornered myself into it, because usually I am one to buy yarn specific to a project. I have a pattern in mind. I'm planning to start it pretty soon. So in the absence of feeling extremely compelled by a particular pattern that I was ready to go on, I just wasn't gonna be buying yarn for a colorwork sweater. Until I went on a trip, and I was in a local yarn store, and I found this gorgeous, very natural looking wool that was locally sourced, and I was like, what if this was the base yarn for a colorwork sweater that I will then have to buy some contrast colors to go with? But I'm gonna buy an amount of this that's kind of just shy of a comfortable sweater quantity, so that I kind of have to use it with another yarn. And I'm kind of forcing myself to finally broach this idea of the stranded colorwork sweater. So that's what I did. That's how I kind of finally convinced myself to do this and went looking for a pattern that I wanted to use from there. So that was sort of my experience as a knitter going into this. I have a pretty high threshold for like trial and error in learning new things in my knitting. I'm very results driven. So like if I want to make this thing, I'm gonna figure out how to do it. But spoiler alert, I could have knit this 3 years ago. Like in no way did I really need the knitting experience that I've gained over the last few years. Like those were not really building blocks building me up to me being able to do this. I do think that there are certain decisions that I made in like the details of it where that experience does come through, but I could have made like 95% the exact same sweater 3 years ago. So this is just me here to say stranded colorwork is not hard. There are definitely things that you can learn or skills that you could work on building to make it, like I said before, more efficient, but I didn't do that. And I still ended up with a really beautiful sweater that came together shockingly quickly. So let's get into the process. So in my quest to make my first stranded colorwork sweater, the pattern that I landed on was the Serendipity by Knitting for Breakfast. This pattern costs €5.50 or about $8.50 Canadian, and it's designed to fit between a 62 to a 66 inch bust, just depending on how much of the recommended positive ease that you want. And I was knitting a size 4, which is a higher number of size than I'm typically knitting in patterns, which means that this pattern also accommodates a much smaller bust size than a lot of patterns do. So if the lower end of the size range is the one that's actually usually your problem, this could be a really good pattern for you to look into. And in terms of construction, like I think the vast majority of stranded colorwork sweaters, this is knit top down in the round with a circular yoke design. Now I will get up to show you this whole thing, but I kind of want to wait and do that later because I kind of want to show you aspects of the sweater as they become relevant as we move through the process. So patience. So like I mentioned, once I started knitting this, it came together super quickly, like alarmingly quickly, but the build up to it had actually been going on a lot longer. So this process all started on October 28th, okay? So that is when I was in Vancouver and I went into the Bad Anna's yarn store and I found, well, this is what's left of what I found. So this is a DK weight 100% Romney wool from Shelterwood Fiber Co., which is based in BC. This is their natural dark gray brown color and I just loved it. I was like, I feel like if I'm going to buy yarn from this local yarn shop, buying yarn that is also locally sourced from within the province, from this small yarn brand, that just seems like the ideal kind of yarny souvenir. So I brought home 4 skeins of this, which cost me $117 Canadian. So when I got home, I was like, okay, now I need to figure out what am I doing with this? So I kind of started, poking around Ravelry, favoriting things, looking at different options. And then a few weeks later, on November 17th, I spent a bunch of time making mock-ups. And if you have not been here before, I love making mock-ups. I made a whole video about how I make mock-ups to try to figure out what I want to knit. So once I landed on the Serendipity, I bought the pattern and just played around with the color chart a whole bunch. And I did all kinds of things. Like not only was I testing out different color combinations, I was testing out different numbers of colors because the pattern is designed to have 4 colors in total, like your main color and then 3 contrast colors. And I was like, okay, but what does it look like if it only has 2 contrast colors or only 1 contrast color? Do I like that more or less? Or do I like it altered to only 2 contrast colors this way or that way? So I was doing all kinds of messing around with this. And I was also just trying to figure out which colors would work well, because as much as I loved this yarn, I think it's so pretty, I really found it tricky, the warmth of it, the gray brown of it all. I found that a lot of colors put next to it felt very 70s in a way. It just kind of felt like everything was giving like avocado carpet. I don't know. I was having a really hard time with it. That is part of what led me to the Serendipity at all. I really like the idea of having the top of the yoke being in a different color and interacting with the contrast colors in a different way than this would. I felt like that might help mitigate the 70s-ness of it all. And in doing that mock-up process, one thing that I eventually hit on was, wait a minute, what if I used a variegated yarn as one of my contrast colors? What if instead of trying to pick solid tones, I was actually picking something that would bring in a lot of different tones, and maybe that would be a way to avoid some of the weird color palette things that I felt like I tried every hue in the world and all of them looked kind of weird next to the brown. That I was like, wait a minute, what if I bring in a lot of them next to the brown? And somehow that idea seemed to work a little bit better to me. So that's when I really got attached to the idea of using the colorway Inko from La Bien-Aimée as one of my contrast colors. But I kind of hit a wall in November because I couldn't figure out where to source that from. It seemed really hard to find without ordering it direct from La Bien-Aimée, where I think the shipping was flat rate and like extremely expensive coming from France to Canada. So I was trying to let go of that, but struggling to come up with a different option I liked better. So this idea kind of languished a little bit longer. And then it was December 11th that I actually placed a yarn order because I found out that Wool & Co., which is based in the US, could order in Inco for me. But it was a special order, which would mean it would take a few weeks for them to get it from the BNMA before they could even start getting it ready to ship it to me. But I was like, it's fine. I'm scared to knit this project anyway, so that's fine. Take all the time you need. So from them, I ordered both the colorway Inco and Winter in the Merino DK base, which cost me $77 US or about $110 Canadian, which includes half of the shipping cost of the package because I did also order yarn for a different project in the same shipment. Was there duty on that one that I didn't note down here? And because I'm in Canada and because duties are suddenly being charged on every single package coming across the border in a way that they did not used to, I also had to pay an additional 36 Canadian dollars in duties on that package, which brings our total yarn cost for the project to $256 Canadian or $187 US. And if we add in the pattern cost, that brings the whole project cost to $265 Canadian or $195 US. And then, like I said, because this was a special order, it took quite a while for this to come in. So on March 3rd, I finally had all of my yarn that I needed to begin this project, except that I was in the middle of another project. I'm a pretty monogamous knitter, so the yarn did sit there for a little bit, but then April 17th, it was time to swatch. So when it came time to start my swatch, I was like, you know what? Forget learning to do this like properly. I'm not gonna learn any sort of fancy way to hold my yarn, not right now. Maybe if I love color work, maybe in the future I will try to pick that up, but right now, I just wanna make this as approachable as possible. So I am an English style knitter. I am just gonna knit this English style one strand at a time. So that means that when I'm switching colors, I'm just going to put down the strand of yarn I'm currently working with and pick up the other one. And is that going to be slower than other methods of knitting stranded color work? I'm sure it will, but this is also the one that I am willing to do. And that is in fact what is key. So that's the method that I decided to try out for my swatch. And I had no issues doing that with my swatch. I found it very comfortable. I found it not nearly as disruptive or slow as I thought that it would be. I kind of worried that that was gonna feel super annoying. And it did not at all. It was very intuitive to me. Actually, the hardest parts of swatching were just trying to figure out how to do a swatch for stranded color work, because I just kind of started it and very quickly found myself running into issues that I hadn't thought about and was just kind of like, oh, how do people do this? Because I wanted to knit a swatch that would reflect my gauge in the round. So I was doing that thing where, you know, you knit the length of your little swatch and then you slide it to the other end of your needles, and then you just sort of have one very long float coming around the back. And that's always worked for me in swatching things that were using a single color of yarn, but I very quickly ran into the problem where as soon as you have multiple colors coming and going at various distances from the end of the row, it just meant that so many stitches looked sloppy, because when you're knitting a swatch like that that's sort of faux in the round, the very edges of your swatch are kind of like loose and weird, right? Because the nature of the yarn floating around the back means that the stitches at the edges aren't really held securely the way that they normally would be. And now, trying to apply this strategy to stranded color work, the beginning of every color of yarn used in a row was doing that wherever it started. So it was just creating like a real mess. And I was like, this is not gonna be an accurate reflection of what my gauge is, because it's just a disaster. So I started Googling, like, how does one swatch for color work in the round? And I saw a lot of like, oh, you have to do it actually in the round. And I kind of just sat there and was like, what does that mean? I thought that's what I was doing. Isn't this how you swatch in the round? And then after perhaps more digging than it should have taken me, what I realized they actually meant was like, you have to actually knit like the leg of a sock. Like you're knitting an actual little tube, which means you're either gonna be doing it on shorties or using magic loop. And I cannot stand shorties. I very briefly owned a pair and then immediately gave them away because I hated them. So I was like, okay, we're magic looping the swatch, great. But then I also found, oh, there's kind of an issue that I'm running into in trying to do stranded color work on magic loop. And fear not, because like I did end up using magic loop for color work later in the sweater and the sleeves. It's totally fine. This is actually not an issue. But the issue that I was running into was that at the point where you're sort of like halfway through your round and you have to switch to the other needle, any yarn that was floating was kind of doing a weird thing when I was switching to the other needle, which is that it would just jump the gap. So if it was 3 stitches before the break in the needles that it last appeared, and then it was going to appear again 3 stitches after the needles, it would just hop right across the needles in a straight line and not be leaving the full length of the float of those 6 stitches that it would actually need in order for the fabric to lay flat in the end. So I was kind of trying to like leave a little bit extra by kind of just pulling it out a little, but I didn't really know how much to leave. So in the end, my swatch was a little bit imperfect in the center of the swatch. At the other point where the needles split, I cut the swatch open so that it actually would lay flat and I could measure it. But the other spot, there is like a little bit of funkiness that you can see there, but this did prompt me to figure out how to deal with that before I started on the actual sweater. And in case this is a thing that you run into also, the solution that I found is just when you get to the first stitch on the other side of the needles where you're having to bring this color back that you need to have an appropriate length of float, you want to just kind of bend things out a little so that you're effectively bringing the last stitch that it appeared on back in line with it as you're knitting. So you're kind of taking advantage of the flex in your cord and the elasticity of the stitches on your needle to just bring them back into a straight line so that that last stitch isn't still like over here behind it. You're pulling it back out here so that they are kind of sitting relative to each other the way that they actually will in the actual finished garment. One other thing that I learned before starting the swatch that I think was really, really key to this coming out well, especially as a tight knitter, is the advice when you're switching colors, make sure that the stitches on your right needle aren't bunched up. Just take a second if you need to spread them apart so that the stitches are actually sitting on your needle in line with the stitches as they will appear in the finished fabric of your sweater. Make sure they're not bunched up, because if they are bunched and you create your float based on that distance, that's when you will get rippling in your finished object. I cannot say enough thank you to the few people who gave me this piece of advice, because I truly think that that one single piece of information was the difference between this sweater being a frustrating nightmare and how it actually turned out, which is that I am so impressed with it. I think it looks so good, particularly for my first ever stranded colorwork project. The one other thing that I set out to learn before I cast on this actual project was the deal with color dominance. So if this is not a thing that you're familiar with, it just refers to the order in which you hold your yarn, kind of which one sits more in front versus in the back, affects how prominently that color will appear in your design, which isn't really a significant enough difference to matter, except if you're not aware of this as a thing and accidentally switch the two partway through your project, because that can create kind of a noticeable shift in how the colors are balanced in your design. I felt a little bit intimidated by this concept because I kind of knew enough to know that the way that you would address this would depend on the method you were knitting with. And like I was saying, like with knitting one hand English, one continental, or both in your hand in English, or both in continental, or like I was doing picking up and putting down, there's so many different methods of doing stranded color work, and some of the ways that people might explain how to control your color dominance might not make sense if you're doing it in one way or another. And so I felt a little bit like, how many tutorials am I gonna have to watch before I find one that makes sense to me and for the way that I'm knitting? And I hate watching tutorials. And thank you to my friend Lauren, who was like, this is the one color dominance tutorial to end all color dominance tutorials. And she was correct. So if you need one, go watch the tutorial from Brooklyn Tweed, rest in peace, because that tutorial on color dominance is so good. They also show it using different handedness methods of knitting stranded color work, and even if the way that you do it isn't a way that they show, I think that the way that it's explained really gives you all of the information that you need to understand how you would apply it to however you're holding your yarns. So I highly recommend it. I'm not going to try to explain to you at all how to do color dominance here, because I fear that in trying to give a quick overview, I might actually make it sound more complicated than it actually is and put you off of it. And I don't want to do that, because it's actually so simple. So just go, let Brooklyn Tweed explain it to you. They'll do a great job. I'll leave a link in the description. So now this brings us to May 3rd, and I want you to remember that date. This is a key date, okay? Because this is our cast on date. And I would like for you to keep that in mind as we progress through this timeline. And to clarify, no, I was not on vacation during any of this. Yes, I was still working my normal hours at my normal job. Did I have any fewer responsibilities in my life than normal? No. Did I perhaps neglect some of the ones that could be put off for a while? Maybe. Was my house perhaps less clean than usual during this period? Perhaps. But so that's the date that I cast it on, May 3rd, and kind of immediately I was making modifications because I am me and that is a thing that I will do. So the first thing that I modified is that the pattern actually has you do your cast on in a contrast color, and I just decided that Just with the addition, I think, of the variegated yarn, I felt like there was enough visual interest stuff going on that I didn't really need that extra contrast color at the collar, so I decided to omit that. I also decided to make this a folded neckband, so instead of just the single layer that's shown in the pattern, I knit the collar for twice as many rows as written, plus one, and then just did around like folding it in half, like knitting it down into itself to secure the folded neckband. And I did that with a slightly larger needle for my right needle to make sure that the neckband didn't end up being like too tight to pull over my head. So for the ribbing, I used the 3.5mm needles recommended in the pattern. And then before you start the Colourwork of the Yoke, you do knit some short rows at the back of the neck to drop the front a little bit, which I really appreciated. I did not appreciate how hard of a time I had for some reason doing the wrap and turns this time. I just found that for some reason on one side they looked fine and on the other side they were way more open, and I kind of had to do some like twisting and pulling and kind of like knitting into not quite the part I was supposed to knit in, just to find a way to like cinch it up a little tighter. So those are not like my tidiest work. Let me see if I can show you. So that's all in the white area there. I think you can see it if you're looking for it, but also like it's at the back of my neck. And like, if I hadn't said that to you, would you have thought twice about it? Probably not. Like I kind of was like, should I rip this back and try it again? And then I was like, no, it's not worth that. It's funny though, because I've definitely done wrap and turn before and don't remember having this problem, but it's also been a long time. Any sort of short row is something that I kind of have to relearn how to do it every time I encounter it in a pattern, whether it's German short rows or just a wrap and turn or whatever. It's one of those things that never stays in my head, and just this time I just had a harder time than average doing it. Or maybe it was just more visible in this yarn than it normally is, because so the Merino DK, which is what I was using for my contrast colors, it is a superwash, which does tend to kind of keep a more crisp stitch definition. It doesn't tend to sort of blend in the same way, so maybe that's a factor, I don't know. The Romney wool that is my main color though is not a superwash yarn. So the next day on May 4th, I finished the whole neck situation and I was starting the Colourwork Yoke, which was very exciting to me. I was doing this on 4.5mm needles, which is up a little bit from the 4mm recommended in the pattern, which I had assumed. When I did my swatch, I did it on 4.5mm needles because I tend to have to size up on needles, and I had also heard that if you are a tight knitter, it's even more likely that your gauge is going to come out tight in Colourwork knitting. So I was like, we're not even gonna mess around with 4mm needle. We're just gonna swatch on 4.5. So that's what I did, and that got me right on gauge. So that's what I used, and as soon as I'd finished the ribbing for the neckband, I switched to my 4.5mm needles to start on the yoke. Kind of as soon as I started working on the Colourwork Yoke, it became apparent to me that I think I picked a really good pattern to use for my first stranded colorwork, and in kind of ways that I wouldn't have thought to look for, but I think I just lucked into a good one. Like if you are looking to knit your first stranded colorwork sweater and this pattern appeals to you, I would definitely recommend it. For one, because I think that the chart itself is very manageable and easy to work from. Like at its widest point, it's 16 stitches wide, but even then, in almost every case, you're really only paying attention to like a 6 or 7 stitch repeat, and the only thing that's changing and necessitating the chart being 16 inches wide, it's like there's a little bit of extra white space in between these 2 repeats of it. Like overall, I found it so easy to remember what I was supposed to be doing each row. There were kind of a few rows where it took a little bit more to get it into my brain, but even those were not bad, and the vast majority of them I found really, really easy. So I really didn't have to spend very much time actually looking on the chart while I was working on this at all. It was more just sort of like, I finished a row, okay, what am I doing next? Okay, I got it. Another thing that I think makes this a really approachable colorwork pattern is, despite the fact that the original design uses 4 different colors of yarn, there are only 6 rows in the whole thing where you're using 3 strands within one row. The rest of them are all just 2 colors, and then in my version, because I ultimately reduced from 3 contrast colors plus base color to just 2 contrast colors, I only had 4 rows where I was using 3 colors at the same time. And that's not even to say that it was like difficult to use 3 colors in one row. I wasn't really sure what that was going to be like. I didn't find it hard at all. It was just kind of, it's just a little bit extra fiddly. And I think maybe if I were doing a whole thing where it was 3 strands in every row, I might have found that a little bit less fun to work on. So I think knowing that it's only 6 rows in the entire thing in the original pattern, like it's nothing. You can do it. Other thoughts from knitting the yoke? It was not slow. Like the whole like picking up one yarn, putting it down, picking up the other yarn. I thought that might be annoying and slow. I mean, if that was slow, God help me if I was knitting it a more efficient way. Like I can't afford to knit sweaters this fast. Like I found that such a non-issue. Perhaps how fast it was coming together, like the slowness of that was maybe mitigated by how just like compulsively I felt I needed to work on this. But it certainly did not prevent this from coming together quickly. There was really something about working my way through this chart that I felt it was like addicting. Like I would be doing my work during the day and I'd be like, when can I work on my sweater? I want to be done work. I want to go to my sweater. Just in a way that, I mean, I always want to like unwind with my knitting at the end of the day, but it was just, this was different. It was like a rabid need to get back to it. I wanted to see the colors come together. I wanted to get to the next part in the chart. It was so compelling to work on in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced in my knitting before. And I'm a little bit like, oh, you gotta be careful with this because it's powerful. We can't be doing this all the time because with this on the needles, it is all I want to do. So if I ever want to accomplish anything else in my life, I cannot currently have stranded color work on the needles. Like I truly was obsessed. And I think that this is also compounded in the nature of a circular yoke because when you start, each round is quite small, so you're really making really rapid progress, and I think that really feeds the like motivation, right? Like, oh my god, the next one, the next one, the next one. And so I will say it definitely slowed down a little bit, became a little bit less frantic when I reached the full width of the yoke right before splitting for sleeves, where it's at its biggest and rows are taking quite a while, but it took over my life, truly. I was also really happy seeing it work up and seeing that it was laying really nice and flat and that I didn't seem to be having weird rippling issues with my tension. Like that advice of just making sure that your stitches on the right needle are always spread out before you pull a float across, like golden advice. I didn't end up with any puckering anywhere in the color work. The only spot where I think that you can see a little bit of weirdness is actually, interestingly, I think not from the floats, but from increases. So in these two brown areas, there are a couple of rows where a lot of increases happen quite quickly, and it was fairly subtle, and I think it blocked out like almost entirely. But if you just kind of like bunch the fabric a little bit, like it's clear that the way that it wants to bunch is exactly where that puckering would have been. So it still has sort of a little bit of a shadow of its former slightly puckery self. And I'd be curious to hear if you have more experience than I do in knitting circular yokes, or I don't know if this is particular to circular yokes that have color work, if this is an issue that you're familiar with and having tension issues only where increases are. I would love to know any tips. But I feel like by and large, like for this being my first ever stranded colorwork project, like I think that's pretty good. Like I really expected to have to make peace with some puckering. So to look at this finished object and only be able to see any at all if I look really closely in a particular area, I think that's like a really good outcome. That's much better than I anticipated and kind of feared having to pretend to be okay with. One concern that I did have when I started knitting up the yoke was I was like, I don't know if this variegated yarn is cooperating, because of course when you're working with variegated yarn, you don't have a ton of control over the placement of how each color is going to come in. And as I was working on it, let me show you the back for a second. Look closely at the back of the neck. See how like the entire back is just the yellowy green color for like a decent distance? Like it's not until you get to the triangles that you see anything else. And then even then, I will show you when I stand up later, the whole back, because the color distribution ended up definitely being less ideal on the back than on the front. But you know what? If it was gonna be one or the other, that's the way it should be. I'm much happier to have a well-distributed front, so fine by me. And I feel like the entire front turned out looking fantastic. But when I was just starting the yoke and I was just seeing that row after row, the whole back was just this green color, I was like, like, is the repeat on this variegated yarn just very ill-suited to the nature of this project? Maybe. So I was starting to wonder if that was gonna be an issue. I was like, okay, I'll keep working on it for a bit. I'll see how it goes, but like I might have to reevaluate. But as I was working on it, it got a lot better. And like I said, the only parts that I'm like, that's not an ideal color distribution, it's all on the back, so it doesn't matter. And I think because of the nature of a circular yoke, because it's always getting bigger round by round, the way that the repeat in the variegated yarn like travels around the circumference of the sweater keeps changing with every round, because every round is longer than the last one. So I think that kind of helps to mitigate potential weird pooling issues with variegated yarns. So I was a little bit concerned up front, but it worked out so well in the end. But I will say, if you do like the idea of using a variegated yarn in stranded colorwork, my one tip, I do think it's really important in order for it to work well as a contrast color and to not kind of muddle the motif of the pattern. It's really important to make sure that none of the shades in your variegated yarn overlap at all with any of your other contrast colors or with the body color itself. Because even if it's just like a little speck in this that was the same brown as this, every time that a stitch appears in that color, anywhere that's sort of close to where your main color appears, it's going to make it look like that stitch is in the main color and part of whatever the design is doing in the main color, and will just look either like an error in your pattern or just a weird like fuzziness to the pattern that is not actually supposed to be there. So like I love how Inco ended up working as my contrast color. I think that it worked out so well, and I think that the motif is still really, really clear, but I think that it's only that successful because it is entirely different from each of the colors that I was pairing it with, right? Like there is no overlap between these 3 balls of yarn whatsoever, and I think that that is really key to a variegated yarn working out in stranded color work.
Editing Alley, hi. I meant to mention here also, I think that the single best way to check if you're gonna have enough contrast to make this work in your pattern is by converting your picture to black and white. It makes it so clear so instantly whether you have too much like tonal overlap in your different colors, because say the variegated yarn you want to use has like a really dark blue in it and you're like, that's totally different than the black that I'm gonna use as my main color. That's totally fine. Convert it to black and white and you might see that there's not as much tonal contrast as you might think or want there to be. And I would just urge you to err on the side of caution with this when it comes to picking your contrast colors, especially when using variegated. It's like, don't ruin a really beautiful color project for yourself using a really beautiful variegated yarn by pairing it with a color that it's going to kind of interfere with and get muddled by, rather than contrast really nicely. Also, by the way, thanks for the headphones. My YouTube money helped me buy these because I've been finding lately, I've only ever used like the little in-ear earbuds, and that's always been totally fine, but I think just the increased number of hours I've been spending with them in my ears lately doing video editing, it's just started to get really uncomfortable. And I was like, I think it's time to get some like giant headphones that sit like over my ears so it's not pressing on them or in them, and it's just like cushy and I feel like I'm like hiding in my little headphone bubble. Really enjoy. Thank you so much.
One thing that I found kind of funny in working this up is that I had learned from the color dominance tutorial, thank you to Brooklyn Tweed, that if you are managing your yarns correctly to maintain a consistent color dominance, your strands will not get twisted. Like you'll be working from multiple balls at the same time because you have multiple colors, and they will stay running parallel, not getting twisted, as long as you're managing your color dominance correctly. Which is just funny because it would mean that every time I got to the end of the row, it would be kind of like a little report card of how well I did on my color dominance in that round. Like every single time in that round that I was creating a float, was I doing it correctly? Was I holding it the right way relative to the other strand of yarn? Or did I mix it up that time? And if I had any twists between my 2 balls, that exact number of twists would tell me exactly how many times I messed up. Which, to my credit, was not very many times. It's not as though the yarns were tangled disaster, but it's also not as though I absolutely perfectly applied color dominance and never made one single mistake accidentally passing a yarn under the other when it should have been over. You know what? It's not perfect, and the odd twist here and there in my yarn was there to tell me that. Now, the further that I got in my yoke, the more nervous that I started to get, because I started to think, it doesn't really look like I have a whole lot of this white yarn left. And I'm growing increasingly concerned that I might run out of it. Not only because, that I tried to buy more yarn, but because I had tried to keep my life simple in tackling my first stranded color work and thinking, okay, I'm buying the La Bien-Aimée Merino DK for the colorway Inco. It feels a little bit silly, a lot silly actually, to spend indie dyer prices on basically a white yarn. Basically, like, might as well be undyed yarn. But I was like, I just feel like it might be worth it in this case to know that these 2 yarns are the exact same base, and any gauge discrepancy is kind of one less thing that I need to worry about in making my first stranded color work. So I'd made the decision, it's worth it to me to buy 1 skein of white indie dyed wool. That'll be fine. But the prospect of having to buy a second one for like $35 US before any kind of shipping, no thank you, no thank you, no thank you, no thank you. So I was growing increasingly concerned that that might happen. And I was like, okay, if that does happen, hopefully, like, there's probably a point in the design where I could switch to a slightly different white where it wouldn't be too obvious just because of where it falls in the pattern and there being kind of a natural break point. So that kind of became my plan B, but I didn't like that plan because what if it ends up being more different looking a white than I think, and then it looks really bad? You know, I had concerns. I felt like I was playing yarn chicken, and I realized that if I did run out, it would be my own fault, because guess who used more white yarn than the pattern would have thought that I was going to and giving me my yardage estimates? What a nice double folded collar. Such a nice collar. Wouldn't it be a shame if it made you lose yarn chicken? So I'm very grateful to say, I mean, as you saw a minute ago when I held this up, I do have a little bit of white left. So we survived. We did not lose yarn chicken. We did not lose it because of our double folded collar, which if it had been just that difference, like the worst part of that would be that it was entirely self-inflicted, that really almost cost me, particularly since, so the Merino Decay from La Bien-Aimée comes in skeins of 115 grams, okay? This is 13 grams. So if that yarn even just came in a standard 100 gram skein, which I think is very common, probably a lot more common than 115 grams, I would have been out of luck. But the really shocking part to me when I finished this yoke is that the entire yoke only used 25 grams of Inco. And like this is significantly smaller than it was when I finished the yoke because I did fleas all the way down the sleeves and all the way down the body. So just after the yoke, there was even more left than this. And I just could not believe, like for the amount of it that appears in this yoke, that's only 25 grams? Like how? That just did not seem possible to me. So I was really shocked by how little of that I used.
Hi again. So I wanted to pop in here and I think I want to do a giveaway with this little yarn that's left over because I realized like I used less than half of the skein, which would mean that if someone out there is looking to knit a similar pattern at a similar size, then this would be more than enough yarn to do that with. And so I think that that would be a better use of this yarn than it just sort of going into my scrap pile and like maybe eventually making its way into something, but like it's kind of busy to function in the way that I think I would generally want to use a scrap yarn if I were going to do a scrap yarn. Anyway, none of this is important. What is important is that if you would like to use this in something similar, leave me a comment telling me what you think you want to use this in, and I will pick somebody to mail it to, and I'll announce in the next video who that's going to so we can get in touch. So let me know if you would like this.
So like I said, I was working on this obsessively, and as a result, I was done this yoke in a week. So on May 9th, I was like, you know what? I think we should do a mid-project block on this. Both to kind of check how my tension is looking on the yoke, like working it up. I feel like this is looking really, really good, but I would just like to check that with blocking before I go on and knit the rest of the body. And also, truthfully, I was like, I think I need to give myself the like 24 hours that this is gonna take to dry to make myself do other things because I have been so glued to this for the last 7 days that I think I need to force myself to do something else. So we did a mid project block. Now I mentioned before that I was knitting this out of a combination of superwash and non-superwash yarns. So both the winter and the Inco colorways are superwash, and then the brown, more natural wool is in fact a natural non-superwash. And it's also just a more rustic yarn in nature. Like if I hold these both up to the camera, you can see this one definitely has more toothiness and kind of like fuzzies on it than this one does. And I feel like the way that this plays out in the yoke works quite well. I was actually a little bit concerned when I realized that my contrast colors were superwash. I hadn't really put that together at the time that I decided to order them, but I feel like it worked out really well. I think that the fact that it's my base color that is a non-superwash yarn allows it to be this really sort of nice base on which everything else sits, because it, by nature being more rustic and non-superwash, has a little bit less stitch definition than the superwash does. And I know that more rustic yarns are really popular and tend to be recommended for stranded color work because the way that it will sort of bloom and relax in more rustic yarn will sort of smooth out the individual stitch like pixel art nature of a colorwork pattern and allow you to see more just the overall shapes. And I think that this pairing allowed me to kind of get the best of both worlds, because my more rustic base yarn kind of is still giving me some of that same fuzziness around the edges that I think does really encourage you to more see the shapes as a whole rather than individual stitches. And I didn't have to like not get this super fun variegated yarn just because it's superwash, and that's not ideal for colorwork, you know? I will also say I did have a slight panic like when this was in the sink blocking, when it was like far too late, everything was already wet. I was like, what if the colors bleed? What if the Inco does weird things bleeding onto the winter? Like one of my contrast colors is white. Like, was this a bad idea? Like, should I have washed this yarn before I knit with it? Should I have at the very least acquired some sort of color catcher to throw in the water when I was doing this? But I had this thought too late, and I was just like, I don't know. We don't really have any options right now other than hope it's fine. And pleased to report it was totally fine. But this is a thing that kind of the moment I saw the water hit the sweater, I kind of had like flashbacks to like other people who I've seen posting about bleeding in their colorwork patterns. I know I've seen some of those porcelain sweaters, like the royal blue on white pattern sweater, where that had happened to people. And so I don't really have advice for you from my own experience because it didn't happen to me, but it did make me think like, oh, maybe this is a thing that if I do more color work, I should be thinking more preventatively about. So if you are someone with more experience knitting color work, and if you have tips of how to mitigate potential bleeding issues, please let us know in the comments, because I'm useless on that front and it just occurred to me at the last possible second and I just got lucky. And post that mid-project block, like I said before, I do feel like some of the slight puckering that I was seeing around the increases did smooth out a little bit. It's not perfect, like I said before, I can still see it a little bit if I'm really looking for it, but I don't feel like it's not what you see when you see the sweater. You know, I have seen much more egregious cases of puckering color work, things that had me quite scared for how mine might turn out, and I feel like this is nowhere near that category. So I felt confident moving forward onto the body. So after my 24-hour banishment from the sweater while I was waiting for blocking, on May 10th, I started the body, and I decided that I wanted to make a bit of a modification to the pattern here as well. Because if you look at the pattern pictures, you can see there are some of those little like fleece specks below where the yoke pattern ends. They're in sort of like a randomized configuration fading out. And I didn't love something about it. I think that there's a thing where it's very hard to make things look random when they're not random, and something about the randomization of them just looked a little bit off to me. And I just decided, like, if this is fundamentally going to be a repeating pattern, I would prefer for it to just be like an actual structured looking repeating pattern. So I just decided to modify mine so that my sleeves would be evenly spaced and go all the way down the body and the sleeves of the sweater. I should also mention, when I finished my yoke and switched to just knitting the rest of the body, I switched my needle size down from the 4.5 millimeters that I had been using to 4 millimeters, which is also the size recommended in the pattern. But when I did my project swatch, I found that in the rows where I was doing my stranded color work, I was meeting gauge really well, but I could sort of see that at the bottom when I switched to just doing some solid base color, I saw that my swatch was going a little bit this way. It was just a little bit wider at the bottom, which was telling me, okay, when you're not knitting stranded color work, you're actually knitting a little bit looser. So you're gonna have to adjust your needle size to accommodate it. So that's what I did when I started the body. So to figure out how to modify the fleas to do what I wanted to do, I literally just like searched for projects on Ravelry that had fleas in them and just looked for the ones that I liked the look of the best. And then I just zoomed in really closely on their pictures and I just counted like how many stitches are in between each stitch in a row, how many rows are in between the rows that have fleas in them. And I just picked the one that I liked the best and I just copied that. Initially I was also thinking, well, maybe I still want to do a fade from denser fleas to more, which also, can we call these something other than fleas? Is there another name for these? Because I find that like kind of gross and I'm having to say this word a lot of times, but here we are. So initially I was thinking I might try to replicate the way that it fades in the original pattern from top to bottom, just with a more regimented structure to the way that the fleas are spread out and around. But also part of this was thinking that like, well, I don't know if I will have enough yarn to even do fleas all the way down the sweater. This is what I have left after finishing the sweater. So I definitely had enough. And it was fairly clear to me after finishing the yoke, oh, I am not gonna have a shortage of this colorway, so I can actually do as many fleas as I want. And I decided that I liked the idea of them going all the way down. I was also wondering when I was starting the body, I was like, do I need to go back to 4.5 millimeter needles on each row where I'm knitting fleas? Like, is it going to give me weird like puckering kind of at each color work row? If I don't, like if I am in fact knitting tighter and stranded color work, is that gonna be like a thing? Because I really don't want to have to change my needle size every time. That seems really like, I use interchangeables and it's in the round, you don't have to change one of the two needles, but it just seemed really annoying. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna not. And if it becomes a problem, then we'll deal with it. Then we'll rip back a little bit. We'll deal with changing our needle size, but I'm just gonna see what happens if I don't. And I'm here to tell you, I cannot tell. I don't see any like age discrepancy on the flea rows. I think they're just, it's spread out enough, it's minor enough, it's totally fine. At least for me. Your mileage may vary, but I would say don't worry about it. Only worry about it if it gives you cause to worry about it. Working the sweater up has also had me thinking like, is this just how I use variegated yarns now? Because I have a long documented history on my channel of this problem where I tend to really like how variegated yarn looks in a skein, but I tend to not like nearly as much the way that that skein looks when it's knitted up into a solid fabric. And like maybe this was just serendipitous on my serendipity, forgive me. But I really love the way that the colors from the variegated yarn played here. And I'm wondering if just the sort of way that contrast colors will pop in and out in a colorwork pattern, like maybe that's the way that I like variegated yarn. So this is the thing that's kind of gonna like live in the back of my head now. I think anytime I see variegated yarns that I'm like, ooh, I really like this in a just like, ooh, shiny kind of way, but I know I wouldn't like it as like a solid fabric. Interesting. Very interesting. Also has me wondering whether I should be trying mosaic colorwork next, because I think, I mean, my impression is that Andrea Mowry is sort of the queen of mosaic knitting, and I know that her patterns are known for using spin cycle yarns, which do some color changey things, which really makes me think that mosaic knitting might be especially well suited to using variegated yarns as your contrast color. All very interesting. All things I'll be thinking about going forward. So in knitting the body, I actually only knit, I think, a couple of inches on it before I started on the sleeves, which means I started the sleeves on May 11th. I just prefer to get my sleeves out of the way. So as soon as I had run out of the first ball of my main color yarn on the body, I was like, okay, it's time to get started on the sleeves. And this is when I had to contend with the stranded colorwork on magic loop every time I was doing a flea row, which wasn't my favorite thing in the world, but that little trick I mentioned earlier of just like folding it back so that it is in a straight line while you're creating your float, that was really all that I needed to know, and that helped out a lot. And actually, I will leave a link to the tutorial that I used, which was actually from the queen of mosaic colorwork herself, Andrea Mowry. So I will leave that link in the description below in case my subpar attempt at explaining it here doesn't do the job for you. So once I figured that out, the sleeves were really smooth sailing. The only issue I ran into at all with the sleeves was I initially thought that I would want to do a row of fleas right before I started the cuff, thinking like, well, the cuff itself is going to be kind of a relatively long, expansive, uninterrupted main color, so I probably want to have the fleas happening as close to it as possible, so it's not like long solid chunk of main color and then another long solid chunk of main color. But I actually found when I did that, I hated it, because what ended up happening is that with these sleeves, you work some decreases throughout the length of the arm, but not a ton. So when it's time to start the ribbing, you first do a round with a decent number of decreases. And I had also decided that I wanted to do extra decreases. I decided I wanted to make sure that my cuff was really nice and tight, like unstretched, it's like quite small, because I wanted these sleeves to be able to be like nice and long and cozy. But in order for your sleeves to be nice and long and cozy and also not super impractical, you have to be able to roll up your sleeves, right? So I wanted to make sure that they would definitely stay where I put them. So I did extra decreases. And I just found that when I did that decrease row, I hated how those last fleas looked. They were sort of getting lost in the like little bit of puckering that you get going into the ribbing. And then based on like where the decreases fell, sometimes it was one of the colorwork fleas that was decreasing. And so it would end up like slightly slanted and you would really see it because it was in the contrast color. So I was just like, ew, dislike, no thank you. So I ripped back and then I did the same number of rows after the fleas as I had in between all of the fleas before I started the ribbing. And I feel like that gave a much more like natural looking, you don't think twice about this kind of look than I was getting the first way that I tried it. Oh, I also knit the sleeves 2 at a time because I always knit my sleeves 2 at a time. Anything where I'm going to be doing like the exact same thing twice in a row, I don't love that. It just tends to feel like ugh when it's time to start the next one, and I feel like it always goes really slowly. So learning to knit things 2 at a time was really, really useful to me. Like it was very simple. It didn't take very long in terms of tutorial watching time or anything like that, but I feel like it was like one of the highest returns on investment that I've gotten in my knitting, especially for something that was entirely elective, right? No pattern is ever like, and now you must knit them 2 at a time. Like you never have to do that, but just taking the time once to learn how to do that, I have been so happy that past me did that. Every single time I'm knitting something 2 at a time. So after one more week, I was finished the sleeves. So May 18th brought me back to working on the body. It was just like, we're in the home stretch. It was a bit less addictive than like the yoke colorwork portion, but at that point the end was in sight, right? And that brings like its own sort of momentum. And so the body went so fast. And in fact, so fast that I accidentally knit like several more inches than I really needed to. It might have been the correct amount originally, and if I were knitting this to the intended pattern length. But one thought that I started having while I was working on this was like, as much as I am obsessed with how this looks within the context of this project, I love how this variegated yarn is working up here. I think it's so pretty. But I had a bit of a concern that in the scheme of like my wardrobe and how I wear clothes and how I style clothes, that this one might struggle to really make its way into the rotation, because there's just something kind of inescapably traditional about this kind of stranded colorwork sweater and how the fit of it was coming out, which is the fit it's supposed to be from the pattern. I think I just realized that like, oh, maybe I would have found it more easy to wear or style if I had knit it like really oversized. That might have felt more like a thing I would wear a little bit more effortlessly, but I mean, now that that ship has sailed, it occurred to me that I might find this easier to work into my wardrobe and for it to be something I would be more likely to reach for more often if I could do something that would make it feel like there was a bit of a twist on it, if it felt a little bit more distinctly contemporary. And the best way that I could come up with to do that was to make it a little bit cropped and also to give it a split hem. So I think this is the time that you get to see the whole thing. One sec.
Ta-da! This is my finished Serendipity. Isn't she beautiful? You can see my split hem here. I am so happy with this decision. I especially love the way that the back hem is a little bit longer than the front. I feel like it makes it really modern and contemporary in a way that's like, there's no way this is actually from the 80s, you know? It just feels, I think, a little bit more easy for me to wear in like a day-to-day kind of way than I would have if it were like regular full length and with a regular hem. So I am really happy with how that turned out. So in terms of length, this sits like maybe like an inch or two above these jeans, which are like right at my belly button, is like right there. So these are sort of like mid high rise. I don't know how, so this is a separate problem. I don't know how to classify jean rise anymore because to me, as someone who was a young child in the early 2000s, low rise means they're like down here, right? So now that low rise is like here, I don't know what this is because relative to my childhood, dating myself, these are still like very high rise. They're just not the most high rise. I don't know what these are called anymore, but my belly button's right here. So yeah, I just am a really big fan of this. Actually, oh, let me show you. I mentioned before that the color distribution is not quite as ideal on the back. And so I think you can see there's a lot of green on the back in a way that like on the front, it's a much more even distribution of different colors. So it's just pure luck that that ended up all being on the back. It could have been the other way and I might have needed to intervene. I actually did intervene once at one point on the back. I don't know, wherever it is actually, if I sit down, can you? No, that's too low. I'm gonna awkwardly like half squat here. Can you see this? Yes, okay. See how, oh, this is a real workout. Okay, so see how from the top, it's basically like yellow, green, yellow, green, yellow, green, so much yellow, green. And then suddenly, I think it's blue, suddenly some other color comes in for a bit. That was where I actually brought in, I was like, you know what, this is not working. I'm cutting this yarn and I'm bringing in a new strand at a different point in the color repeat because I'm gonna force it to work. And I did that and it immediately went right back to being yellow-green. And I was like, I give up. So that was the end of me trying to manipulate the color positioning. If the front had started doing more of what was happening on the back, I would have probably had to stop and reevaluate. I think that I would have been dissatisfied enough with that I would have started looking into ways to manipulate it more. Maybe it would have meant alternating skeins with each row, which I learned from knitting my Tucker fade that I do not enjoy doing, but maybe it would have been necessary. But for the back, I feel like it's good enough. You know, it's not my favorite. I like the front much better, but that's how it should be.
So when I determined that I wanted it to be cropped, and I also determined that I wanted quite a chunky ribbing, that was one of the other changes that I wanted to make it feel really fun and modern. I was like, oh, I need to rip back quite a lot. So I actually ended up ripping back 4 repeats of the fleece from the body. So like a good, like it's about 4 inches. It's about an inch per fleece. So I was like, okay, well, you know, this would have gone by even faster if I hadn't done that, but we don't need this project to go by any faster, so that's fine. So in the end, my ribbing measures 3.5 inches on the front and 4.5 inches on the back. So to do the split hem, I just sat down and figured out exactly where the front and the back split, put in stitch markers, and so I just knit my ribbing for one side of that and then turn it around to work the wrong side. And then at the start of each row, I just slip the first stitch, and that's what gives you a nice clean edge on your split hem. So let me show you. See? Nice and tidy. So yeah, I am really happy with those modifications. I feel like it just made this whole thing a little bit more me. And to check back in on our timeline, so reminder, I went back to knitting the body on, that was May 18th. So it was May 22nd that I ripped back. So within the span of 4 days, I not only knit the body, but I over knit the body, okay? May 22nd, I ripped back, and by May 24th, I had completed my 3.5 inches of ribbing on the front and 4.5 inches on the back. And then I went and I had to weave in all of my ends. And I found weaving in my ends on this trickier than I expected because what I didn't realize is that with Colourwork, it kind of matters like where you weave things in, and it works best if you can weave in your tails into stitches that are the same color as the tail. Because as much as, you know, I'm trying to follow best practices of how to weave in ends so that you don't see them and so that you're still preserving elasticity, it is quite easy for it still to peek through a little bit, which wasn't as big of an issue here. Like in the yoke, I was usually able to find somewhere to weave it into that was the right color, but with the fleas, the fleas were really hard. And so like if you look closely on the sleeve, you can kind of see where this tail got woven in over here, like particularly when the stitches get spread out, like you can just see little hints of that pink a tiny bit. So like thankfully there weren't very many ends that I had to weave in around the fleas, and some of them I was able to kind of hide in like the armpit area, but I found that trickier than anticipated. So if you have tips about this, if you are really good at weaving in ends in Colourwork and you have ideas that might make it a little bit easier for next time, please do let me know. But so I also finished weaving those in on May 24th, which means that May 25th, it was blocked. So refresher, cast this on May 3rd, finished it May 25th. If I had not overknit the body, I probably would have actually finished this project in 3 weeks flat, which is like unheard of for me. I don't knit things that fast. Like I think my fastest sweater up to this point has been in the sort of like just over a month time range, and like that's fast. Most of them are more like a month and a half, 2 months, like somewhere in that zone. 3 weeks is unhinged. Like I cannot even afford to be knitting with this kind of yarn at this rate. Like I simply cannot make a habit of knitting sweaters every 3 weeks that cost upwards of $250 Canadian. Like it's just not viable. I just am floored by how much I loved working on this. I was intimidated by stranded Colourwork, right? I thought that I might find it frustrating or just like tedious, you know, like having to sit there and follow a chart and having to deal with the multiple yarns. And it was not any of the annoying things that I thought it might be. And it was so much fun. And I'm kind of in a funny spot now where there isn't really another pattern in my favorites that I'm like, oh, I really want to knit this. Like I really want to make this object, but I feel like I want to find one because I really enjoyed working on this and I really want to do another stranded Colourwork. I just don't know which one yet, which then also has some gears turning because I have thought for a very long time that I would probably enjoy doing some pattern design at some point. I don't see myself ever really getting into the construction at a super deep level. Like I don't think that I would ever be a designer who's like, here are my 12 different pullover sweater constructions that are all slightly different in all these special ways. Like my brain is just not great in 3 dimensions. I don't see that as a likely path for myself as a pattern designer, but I do think that if I could just figure out like one good solid base pattern for the garment structure itself, I do think that I could have a lot of fun creating different Colourwork charts. And so this is kind of getting those gears turning in my head of like, is this when I start tiptoeing into the world of pattern design, which is kind of scary because that's a very deep rabbit hole. There's so much to learn and I know none of it, but based on how much I loved working on this, that does seem like the kind of thing that would motivate me to finally venture down that rabbit hole and start figuring things out just out of necessity of like, hey, what's the next step to get to this thing that I really want to do? So stay tuned. I could definitely see that being something that happens in the future, but for now I'm just like, what is the miracle that is this sweater? It looks so good. I had such a good time. I have nothing bad to say about stranded Colourwork, and if it appeals to you whatsoever and you've also been avoiding it, please take this as your sign to just dive in because it is so much both simpler and more fun than I ever thought. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. So that brings us to the end of my quite short but very intense saga of my first ever stranded Colourwork sweater. So I would love to know, what is your relationship to stranded Colourwork? Are you watching this because you kind of want to try it out but you were a little bit scared? If so, please take a few minutes, go back through all the patterns that you've favorited over the months to years and tell me which one you would like to promote from a favorite to an actual project, because I think that's something that you should do. I think you're ready. I think it's time. Or if you're someone who has more experience with stranded Colourwork than me, what are your best tips for learning stranded Colourwork? I would love for this comment section to be like a helpful starting point for people who are wanting to dip their toes in. All right, so that's all that I've got for you today. If you'd like to be here next time, I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't already, but if you already have, you're my favorite, and I'll see you next time.